You're listening to WRFI Community Radio News for Tuesday, July 15th, 2014. I'm Maya Cueva. We have Walter Hang from Toxics Targeting with us in the studio today, discussing a recent coalition letter to address the draft of Governor Cuomo's Supplemental Generic Environmental Impact Statement. Thank you for joining us in the studio today.
Thank you for inviting me.
So I understand that your organization, Toxics Targeting, is concerned with issues of fracking. So could you tell us more about your organization?
We're actually not an organization. We're actually a company based here in Ithaca, and we are an environmental database firm. So we have, in the course of 24 years, compiled very detailed information on 700,000 known and potential toxic sites in the state of New York. And we basically attribute the information about landfills, leaking tanks, pollution discharges to spatial locations. And so engineers and environmental consultants and lawyers and drinking water districts and home buyers contact my group and they buy these little reports. And they're called Phase 1 Environmental Site Assessment Database Reports. And they can look at a particular address and they can see, are there concerns on or adjoining the site? And this is part of their due diligence. And so beginning almost 5 years ago, we started using this very sophisticated geographic information system to look at the dangers associated with Marcellus shale gas fracking. And we've been very, very involved politically and public policy-wise to make sure that this practice is not permitted anywhere in New York until comprehensive environmental and public health safeguards are adopted.
So could you speak about some of this action, particularly the letter to address the draft statement? Why is this important, and specifically why is this document important to address?
So the key thing is that not one shale gas production well has ever been fracked in the entire state of New York. And that's because then Governor Patterson declared in 2008, we're not allowing Marcellus shale gas extraction until comprehensive environmental and public health safeguards are adopted pursuant to a very complicated proceeding called a Supplemental Generic Environmental Impact Statement. And that's how come this de facto moratorium has been in effect for almost 6 years. So all across the country, shale fracking has been going on. In nearby Pennsylvania, during just those nearly 6 years, that state has fracked nearly 6,300 Marcellus shale wells. In Colorado, they're fracking 3,000 wells a year. But here in New York, we've completely kept our state shale gas fracking free because in 2009, I developed this critical strategy of making sure that the draft ESCIs that had been proposed by the Department of Environmental Conservation couldn't be adopted because it was shockingly inadequate. It was incomplete. It just wasn't ready for prime time. And so I've been organizing literally tens of thousands of citizens and elected officials and groups to make sure that Governor Cuomo doesn't adopt a fatally flawed, now revised draft ESCIs. And so this latest coalition letter, which people can see by going to toxicstargeting.com, click on Marcellus Shale and scroll down, and you'll see a big red flag that says, sign the coalition letter. So this letter is very plain. It simply says very respectfully to the governor, you have to withdraw this draft ESCIs because it's almost 5 years old. It's absolutely ancient. It has no current information. It ignores literally hundreds of recent reports, government studies, investigations that are absolutely critical for figuring out how can New York State be protected from this massive industrialization.
So could you speak more about this flawed data, and if there is new research that has been released, what new research should be considered instead of this outdated data?
Well, the key thing is that this practice is relatively recent. So Marcellus shale, it's it's maybe an average of 1 mile deep. And it's very, very tight. And it has gas, methane, in these tiny little pores. So the only way to get the gas out of that rock is you have to drill down and through the rock, and then you have to pump this fracking fluid into the rock under enormous pressure. And so that cracks the rock, and then that releases the gas. So the problem is this is a very toxic, contaminating procedure. And so we don't know, number one, what's the full spectrum of pollutants associated with shale fracking? That's never been determined. What's the environmental fate of those pollutants? If they're released into the environment, where do they wind up in air, in land, in water? How does the public get exposed to those contaminants? Do they breathe the contaminants, drink the contaminants, get the contaminants on their skin? And what are the long-term health consequences? And so if you don't know that baseline analysis, then you don't know, well, how much should be allowed in the air? How much should be allowed in drinking water? And how can you possibly safeguard the public that might be living very close to these, ultimately, maybe tens of thousands of wells? And so those fundamental questions really haven't been addressed, but various scientists and various state governments are struggling to try to figure that all out. But unfortunately, the draft ESCIS is now so old, it's so outdated, that it lacks any of that current information.
So it's my understanding that other letters have been sent to address fracking-related matters. So have you seen progress since these other letters have been sent?
Absolutely. And the progress has been so amazingly striking. It's just shocking how effective we've been. So beginning in 2009, I wrote the first coalition letter requesting that then Governor Patterson withdraw the original draft ESCIS because it was incomplete. It just wasn't comprehensive. And a year later, with 1 foot out the door, Governor Patterson signed Executive Order number 41, which required the draft ESCIS to be revised. And no final revised draft ESCIS has ever been adopted. And so that was originally released for public review in 2011. So under any scenario, the data are anywhere from 3 years old, to 5 years old and even older. And so this shows that when citizens are organized, when they're educated, when they're taking effective action, when they're not just forwarding emails in the middle of the night and not just running around ranting and raving, but when they know how to bring very focused pressure to bear on Governor Cuomo while he's running for re-election, it really packs a wallop. And the key thing is we also get enormous press coverage. And that just drives home the point that this is a critical electoral issue. If the governor wants to get reelected, he's simply got to, respond hopefully favorably to this request. And we also want this Department of Health review of the health impact analysis in this draft ESCIS to be halted. And that's another step that has to be taken before shale fracking would be allowed in New York.
So have you faced any criticism around this coalition letter? And if you have, how are you addressing this criticism?
I don't really think I faced any criticism. I mean, people sometimes want shale fracking. They think we're going to become rich. We think this will be an enormous economic, benefit for the state of New York. But the beauty of our letters is that they're very, very well documented. And so we show very carefully how come the Department of Environmental Conservation and the New York State Department of Health haven't done what's required by law. And we've persuaded so many elected officials and so many groups and so many powerful entities that our cause is just, that the governor hasn't been able to go forward and permit shale gas fracking to begin. And during the last 6 years that shale fracking hasn't been allowed in New York, the amount of traditional gas and oil extraction has been dwindling and dwindling and dwindling. And so we're now on the verge of basically ending fossil fuel extraction in New York, and that has caused really irreparable contamination hazards for almost almost 200 years. So this would be an amazing landmark achievement that's never happened anywhere in the country. In 2013, the last year for which permitting data has been released, only one well was drilled in the entire state of New York. Meanwhile, dozens, if not hundreds of wells are playing out. And so they're being abandoned because they're not producing enough gas. And the entire state of New York on a day-to-day basis, the amount of oil that's being extracted wouldn't even fill a backyard swimming pool. So people are always decrying how fossil fuel extraction is so polluting, it's such a hazard to the environment, it's contributing to global warming. But no state has ever done as much as New York to actually resolve that problem. So Marcellus shale gas action has been amazingly effective, and the benefits are basically, I think, unsurpassed in recent environmental activism history.
So I have to ask, do you think that Governor Cuomo will consider these signatures in this letter? And if so, what will be the final push to really make that change?
There's no question he is watching our efforts very, very assiduously. We hear feedback all the time from the people who he is very, very, intimately involved with in terms of making these critical political decisions. And so we know he's feeling brutal heat. The problem is that he could go forward and say, okay, I'm only going to allow it in limited areas where people want it. And this was reported by the New York Times in 2012. And so a lot of local listeners have heard about this home rule decision. And so it allows communities like Dryden to say, we don't want fracking, we're banning it. But home rule is the classic double-edged sword. And so it allows some communities that don't want it to ban it, but it would allow other communities that want it to say, bring it on. So if you look at the map where all the bans are, there isn't one shale fracking ban essentially anywhere where the industry actually wants to frack. And where they want to frack is basically Shenango County, Broome County, Tioga County, Chemung, and Steuben counties. Those 5 counties are where they have set their priority on fracking. And there are no bans in that entire area with the exception of one little village. And people aren't going to frack in a village to begin with. So we're very concerned that the governor could say, I'm going to allow it where people want it. I'm going to allow it where it can do economic good. And if people don't want it, then they can make up their mind. And I think that would be a horrible decision. If it isn't safe everywhere in New York, it isn't safe anywhere. And that's what we're fighting for. Equal protection for all New Yorkers. That's what's embodied in this coalition letter. And we believe that the critical step that has to be taken first and foremost is that a comprehensive public health impact study has to be conducted with all the current information. And then once that study is done openly, transparently, then we think Department of Health and DEC should use that information to come up with a new GEIS. The existing GEIS was adopted in 1992. It's 22 years old. And in 2009, EPA said, you need a new GEIS. We couldn't agree more. So this is so technically complicated. But the bottom line is that the campaign to safeguard New York from shale fracking has been amazingly successful.
So before this comprehensive health study is actually released or conducted, where could listeners go to actually receive this current information and current data on fracking?
That's the beauty of our campaign. They can go to this Marcellus Shale homepage. They can look at all of the hundreds and hundreds of fires, explosions, polluted water supply wells that I've documented with the Department of Environmental Conservation's own data. They can see the documents that I've compiled from U.S. Energy and from other drilling firms where they've actually admitted polluting families' water, paying for water filters. They can go to toxicstargeting.com, type in their address, click search, and they can see, do they live near any abandoned wells that haven't been plugged? So this is all public information that people can review, and then they can decide for themselves. I just think that, so many people in Ithaca and around Ithaca have been involved, but we're not done. and we could lose everything in the blink of a political eye. So if we're able to halt this Department of Health review, which has been conducted in secret without any kind of public review or comment, if we're able to halt this draft Esquisse proceeding, send the whole thing back to the drawing board, we're not going to have shale fracking for years to come. And if we adopt the strict cleanup liability, private right of legal action, and financial surety safeguards that we've all been fighting for so hard, we might never see shale fracking in New York, and the protections that we adopt here can be replicated in the other states that have already begun shale fracking. And that's how come the eyes of the nation are on New York, and that's how come every person helps.
Thank you so much again. And there you have it. This is Walter Hang from Toxics Targeting, and I am Maya Cueva. Thank you for joining us in the studio.
Thank you for inviting me.